Thanks very much. After that, I must admit, rather Orwellian moment, you're all thinking it, I just said it. What we want to do is that we haven't really talked about fans, and certainly, and I've been had the opportunity of being all of the previous four forums, right back to that very small one in Glion 3-4 years ago, is we never really talked about fans. So I think it's quite important in this session that we're going to do that, and we're going to think about it. Now, one thing looking personally, as far as what's actually changed over the last couple of years, is our understanding is improving considerably. And the last 2 days, there really been is a high level of understanding and articulation of what the issues are. I'm not sure we're there yet with fans. So on this panel, I'm hoping there will be some disagreement. There will be possibly a little bit of confusion. And, in a respectful way, some fan-like banter. Yeah? So, but what I want to do first is for all of you to close your eyes. Now, if you feel uncomfortable about this, tough luck. You're meant to feel uncomfortable. Yeah? So I want you all to close your eyes, and I want you to try and visualize a fan. Right? And I want you to think about what they're doing. How did they get there to what they're doing? How easy was it for them to get there and to do what they're doing? There's some people not closing their eyes. I can see you all. Yeah? And also, how do they potentially impact on other people while they're doing what they're doing? Okay, you can open your eyes again now. Have you all got an image of a fan in your head? Yeah? Put your hands up. How many of you visualize someone looking at a screen? How many of you visualized people, men, in a football stadium? Show your hands. That in itself to me is quite telling. Yeah? How many of you people visualized someone in Africa or Latin America? I can see you there, John. You're very proud, yeah? Okay. Right. What we're going to do is hold that thought, right? Hold that thought and hold those thoughts, because there's probably a whole range of diversity. So I'm going to move on to the panel, and I'm just going to very briefly introduce them and then ask them to introduce themselves, their organisation, and what they do. And also I'm going to ask them to introduce what pronoun they use as well. So I'm going to introduce myself, first of all. I'm Steve Gibbons. I'm a he. And I work for Ergon. We're a consulting and research organisation, work on business and human rights and sport. Now, I'll ask everyone else to introduce themselves. Obviously, over there we've got Mary, and I just want to say one thing about Mary. You've all heard a lot about Mary in the last 2 days. Mary, you're off the bench and in the game now. It's time to perform, yeah? So, Ronan first.
Thank you. Evain, Ronan. I'm representing football, and I'm a he. And I'm representing Football Supporters Europe. Football Supporters Europe is a democratic representative organization for, well, it's pretty self-explaining, right? Yeah. For European football supporters. We're a member of the Sports and Rights Alliance. We have been pushing for the recognition, the acknowledgement of fans as stakeholders of the game, as impacted parties. And I have to say, it's been quite a pleasure to hear most of the speakers mentioning fans in their introductory remarks, in their comments. Obviously, I'm looking at FIFA there for forgetting that words in the opening remarks, but yeah, I hope we will be able to work on this in the near future. Great.
Good afternoon. My name is Zhan Chiam. My pronouns are he and him. I work at ILGA, which is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association based in Geneva, which is the world office. We're a global federation of about 1,500 member organizations around the world. But in ILGA, my work is to manage the Gender Identity and Gender Expression Program.
My name is Mary Harvey. I am the incoming CEO of the Center for Sport and Human Rights. I am a she, or her, and germane to this work is the work that I did prior to joining the center. I developed the human rights strategy for the United 2026 bid to bring the World Cup to Canada, Mexico, and the United States.
Hi, my name is Juan Pablo Salazar, Colombiano. I'm a he, and I'm at the governing board of the International Paralympic Committee. The board has appointed me to move the agenda of bridging the gap between the sports and the human rights movements.
Great. And in the spirit of fans as well, feel free to pick which one of your panellists you want to support and cheer for. And just to say, as far as this corner over, as far as the Institute is concerned, like Conservative MPs in the UK, don't feel that you have to support Mary just because you're on the payroll, all right? So what I want to do first, and maybe, Juan Pablo, start with you. When you were closing your eyes and visualizing, who or what were you thinking about?
I remembered very fondly my Russian experience during the World Cup, but not the stadium. I remembered getting to the airport, taking 17-hour train rides from one city to another, and seeing the whole inaccessibility of things around the stadium. Because the stadiums were all right. FIFA does a good job in accompanying organizing committees to have accessibility in stadiums. But you have to think 360 on stuff like that. How are the airports working? How are the train stations working? How are the actual wagons on the trains working, if they're accessible or not? And most importantly, how is the attitude of the people toward people with disabilities?
Mary, who are you thinking about?
Well, bit of an unfair question, because at the bid I had to think about like all the different ways that fans interact with something like the World Cup. So I was thinking of, we used to do the exercise of Honduras has just qualified, and now 2,000 Hondurans get in their cars and start driving north, right? So they come through the southern border of Mexico, and what could happen there? And then they drive up north through Mexico, and they hit the southern border of the United States. Right? Well, there are issues there, for sure. And then let's say they go up and they're driving north into Canada, and they go through the southern border. So I think about how fans enter the country through airports or through roads. And then I thought about fans on television, because one of the issues that we have is chanting. And so that comes through on broadcasts. So it's one thing to hear it in the stadium, but in a lot of cases, whatever's said in the stadium, particularly if the crowd's saying it, it comes through on the broadcast. So if it's something that's offensive, particularly the LGBT community, that comes across as well to people sitting and watching the game. So that's what I thought of.
Zhan, what were you thinking about as you sat with your eyes closed?
So I lived in Australia for 15 years, and that really affected my view on sport. So straight away I thought of a cis male who's white and wearing some sort of scarf with football colors. And I still don't really know the codes. I know there's 2 rugbies and 1 AFL, but I can't really tell the difference. I pictured the person getting there with his mates on a train and drinking very heavily. And I mean, you know, I'm someone that avoids a lot of large sporting events because I just don't feel safe. I mean, it's I don't feel like it's a place where any sort of difference is safe with all of those things added together, you know, with racial, a certain playing out of race and also of gender. So I tend to avoid it, but I definitely did see this person. You know, and in Australia, there's the word bogan, right? So I, definitely saw a bogan.
For those who don't know, I'm not going to translate it, okay? So, Ronan.
Well, first, I thought about my plans for the weekend, which was to go and see my club playing in Nantes. Now, in this country, unfortunately, when there is a bit of a lack of resources, police resources, the first thing that is cancelled is the football. So there will be no football for me this weekend. Then I thought about the fans that represent the most, or the one that are the most exposed. So there would be an away fan, because you're in a different city, you don't know the people, you don't know the police. Then it would be an away fan in a foreign country, because then you don't know the language, you probably don't know the stadium. And then it would be a woman in and women away fan abroad. And those are definitely the most exposed fans, those that are in the weakest position. Of course, with the disabled fans and the wheelchair users, but there are other organizations representing them. So my work, our work, is to guarantee fair conditions for away fans. And of course, when you're in an away country, when you don't know anyone, when you don't know the policing style, then that's when you're the most exposed.
Now, one thing that's coming out of that straight away is, and this is a complex issue as far as fans are concerned, and I think of it in some ways a bit like on, I don't know, in a big mining project, the way that migrant workers are treated. Quite often they'll be treated as something that impacts on a community, but also is impacted themselves. This is a two-way process, and from all of you, you've identified human rights issues that come from something the fans do and the way the fans are treated. Yeah? So, can you talk us through, Ronan? You did lots of work around Russia, not the only place you're doing work. What steps you took and who you worked with to identify what some of those issues were and what the responses were?
Well, the challenge on any mega sporting event in the fan dialogue is to identify progressive fans that are willing to engage with the organizers, with the public authorities in making the tournament more welcoming for everyone. Now it's a two-way process. The organizer of a major sport event, of a tournament like the World Cup, like the Euro, has to establish dialogue with both the local fans in the cities where the competition is being organized, because they are the ones, they're impacted by the competition as well. It's not because their club is not playing in the World Cup that they're not impacted by, like anyone in the local community, by the stadium that is being built, by all the renovation work, by who is working on those constructions, and so on and so forth. So there is a need to engage with fans as part of the local community. Now, if we want the competition to be inclusive as well, the tournament organizers need to speak with the fans representatives that are going up from the organizations, from the nations that are going to travel to that competition. So there's a need to establish line of communication with any legitimate, progressive fan organization that will travel into the country. That's what allows the tournament organizers to, let's say, fit their plans to the expectation, habits of the traveling fans.
And Juan Pablo, you raised some of the issues also on Russia. As far as actually, let's start with the issue of accessibility, and we can go more to social issues as well and norms. What kind of things can sports organisers do to make stadiums and events more genuinely accessible?
I'd say that the important thing is to include communities of people with disabilities since the planning of the event, so that it's easier to work before than to try to fix it. Because it would seem like common sense, but common sense is not all that common sometimes. So yes, well, of course, do the ramps, yes, but also try to be inclusive. If you're going with your friends to a game, you want to be with your friends, and not be in the wheelchair section. So you need to be more creative in the strategies. Also, disability is a very diverse community. Yeah, the easy way to think about it is ramps for wheelchairs. But what other stuff are you doing for other people with different kinds of disability? Are we thinking about maybe technological solutions for blind people to follow the game and stuff like that? So what you want to do is bring civil society organizations to work with the OCOGs to bring together since the beginning of the planning of the event.
And let's come back to that. But Mary and Zhan, the issue that was raised, and both of you raised that issue, as far as potentially negative impacts, potentially hostile environments for some communities and some people. Now, I'm a lifelong football fan. I'm going to a game in London tonight, and some of the things I've heard at times, I prefer to forget, to be quite honest. But what can we do to actually work with fans and clubs and tournaments as well to make stadiums more welcoming places? I mean, Zhan, your point was well taken. I think at the UN Forum, a session we had 2 weeks ago, there was a point made by a South African woman there. It said she learned that actually on rugby nights you didn't go out to bars because it was a dangerous place to be a woman. Now what can we do about that? Easy question, Mary.
Well, first of all, there's a difference. You know, I've heard when we would do stakeholder engagement with particularly, be it, you know, sports federations or national soccer federations, about, well, this issue, that's just custom. It's not meant to be offensive. It's just custom. And so I guess the first thing is an understanding that it's a bit like looking at, you know, sexual harassment in the workplace, right? Whatever was meant by X, Y, or Z is one thing. How it was received by the person on the receiving end is really where we get to the difference between what makes somebody feel uncomfortable and what doesn't. So regardless of whether or not something like a chant or a word that's used in a chant is offensive, it may, oh, that's just customary. That's not meant to be offensive. Okay, well, that may not be how the LGBT community feels about that, right? And that's the point. So I think the first part is understanding that regardless of intent, there's impact, right? So that's the first part, is the education piece, and Hudson Taylor will tell you immediately it starts with education. And the second piece is involvement of stakeholders in understanding the issue. So when you involve stakeholders to talk about bathrooms, for example, right, or chanting, or privacy concerns, when you have people at the table who can tell you these are concerns, oftentimes it's just educating people on the fact that these are risks, that then they go, oh, I had no idea. Okay, so that's the first start. And then beyond that, then you get to, okay, so now let's talk about how you mitigate it. How do you prevent it? How do you mitigate it? And when it happens, how do you report it? And what do you do about it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's laws in place in countries, right? Like, you know, you can't assault someone. You know, there's hate speech laws, there's anti-discrimination laws. But, you know, as I've heard over and over again in this forum, it doesn't matter. I mean, that matters, but what happens on the ground? What is the attitudes of people? So, I mean, a lot of what, you know, we try and do at ILGA is changing hearts and minds of people, right? And how do you change hearts and minds, in this case, so that LGBT or LGBTI people feel like sporting events, sports clubs, you know, your local sporting organization is receptive to you being who you are and expressing, you know, you in your diversity. And by diversity, it's not just about sexual orientation, but also your bodily diversity, your gender identity, your gender expression. You know, I think, so there's lots of things that can happen. I really like what you said about stakeholders. So, you know, you can have sporting champions, right, who call out homophobia or transphobia or intersex phobia, right, who are aware of these things and are able to be champions for that. I think that's really important. And we were talking at lunchtime, right, about the UK rugby team wearing the rainbow flag on their jersey. I think the All Blacks did that as well. You know, so having just like to start with that level of awareness, I think helps people to think about, well, what is it that I'm missing here when I participate in a sporting event as a fan? Yeah, start with that.
And let's pick this up a little bit, actually, and take it from the issue around both around hate speech and things that would be said outside a stadium that are said in a stadium. Because sometimes there's a blindness, and I'll give a slightly trite example of, even from a young age, is that first time I took my daughter to football, she was 6, and there's a chant that Arsenal fans have about their main opposition team, which is Tottenham, which some may be familiar with. And I will beep out, there's a boo over there, I will beep out the swear words. Yeah? And just to show the kind of tribalism that even kids get straight away, is that the song goes, my old man said be a Tottenham fan, I said beep off, beep, you're a beep. Right? So I have a 6-year-old girl next to me, and she pulls on my elbow, and I think, what's she going to say? And she said, how could her dad possibly be a Tottenham fan? Yeah? Because to her, that tribalism and the fact that you're either one fan or another fan overrode everything. So this leads me to the question, you know, how do you work with fans who see insults to other players and other fans as part of the game? Yeah? and both, Sergio's nodding there, and Australian colleagues will know from AFL, which is the one where they don't have sleeves, I think, is there. The level of barracking and banter is both sophisticated, witty, but brutal. Yeah? How, on the points that were just raised there as far as actually how you move behaviours, how do you deal with the fact that sports fandom is brutal on occasion?
Yeah, thanks for the unsolvable question. I think there's different layers of problematic banter and chanting. Now, the priority must be to get rid of any homophobic chanting, of any anti-Semitic chanting, because in European football, at least, this is a major problem. And then the insults, the more civilized banter is, some might argue, is part of the football culture, and we don't want. We want this to remain a game where there's rivals, there's banter, and that's part of the fun. Now, when it comes to most problematic game, it's extremely difficult. If you have a progressive fan base, if you have progressive fan groups that you can address, then you already done half of the job. We had extremely stupid chants for years in France, which is very similar to the puto in Mexico that we discussed earlier. It took over 15 years to get rid of it. For fan groups to understand that this was a stupid chant, but it's only through engaging with them and it works. The chants still exist in clubs where there's no progressive fans, when there's no dialogue, and when no one, including the clubs, are seeing it as a problem. So the clubs are part of the solution, and only if there is an active dialogue, then you can reach a reduction of those chants. Education is the key. You mentioned earlier the fact that LGBT plus people might feel uncomfortable in the stadium. Only through talking to actually impacted persons you can make some of the fans realize that this is problematic. That's what we do. We work. There is an increasing number of LGBT plus fan organizations, and if you invite them, if you meet them, if you give them a space in any of your event, in your discussion with stakeholders, then they are the ones able to explain how hurtful it can be to be in a stadium and hear this kind of chants.
Mary, can I ask you, going back to the United bid, beyond the issues we've just been talking about as far as chants and speech is concerned, what were some of the other fan-related issues? And potentially broaden this out as well, because the other group that we haven't talked about the last 2 days is communities. And in certain circumstances, the community and the fan base is the same thing. Yeah? Whereas in big tournaments, actually, it's very, very different. The fans that will go to watch whatever code of football they play in Dallas in the stadium week on, week out won't be the fans that are there for a FIFA World Cup. Now, what other issues did you pick up as far as fans were concerned?
This was probably the biggest area where, my perspective was broadened tremendously. And this was due to talking, again, I keep saying this to stakeholders. So as a fan, when you come into the World Cup, however you enter the whole experience when you enter one of the three countries, you can face at any point from entry into your stadium experience discrimination. So discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, nationality, disability, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity, among others. So there were those pieces, right? Then there's freedom of expression and assembly, right? That whole piece of whether or not people can express themselves, and whether or not when they're expressing themselves, that also creates problems, right? Freedom of movement and travel particularly came up a lot for reasons that we probably all understand, given the political environment in particularly North America right now around, would there be the ability to move? So we got a lot of questions about that, so we dug into that quite a bit. And then privacy rights. And not just, we talk about players, privacy rights of players, privacy rights of spectators and consumers, protection of personal and financial data. You can't just go capture people's data. You come into the United States through the southern border, and if you don't have a blue passport with eagles on it, and maybe your skin color's a certain way, right? Maybe you're asked for social media information. Right? A lot of people don't know that. I didn't know that because I have a blue passport with eagles on it, and I look a certain way, and maybe I don't get asked those questions. And then the human trafficking piece, so how that influences things. And then finally, just behavior, be it gender-based violence, violence, hooliganism, those sorts of things that we looked at. And I guess the final thing would be is when we looked and met with the LGBT community, it became, I'm not transgendered, so I don't know what that feels like. But when I talk to stakeholders who talk about what they face, be it at simply the act of going to the bathroom at a stadium, I don't encounter problems with that, right? I go to the women's bathroom. But I'm not transgendered, so I don't understand that. I don't know what it feels like to simply have the basic, basic need of having to use the restroom. And that's an issue, right? That shouldn't be that way. And the other thing is when you're going in through a border crossing where you're asked to provide, your gender on your passport, and maybe your gender is different than your gender at birth, and there are issues of people coming in through land crossings based on that. I mean, those are all issues that we looked at about, and it gets back to training and education beforehand.
Can I go direct back on one, actually, Mary? And what did you do as far as, because a lot of those issues, and we're into our straight, what's private, what's state, what's in between, because a number of those issues raised a pure, state responsibilities and obligations. What did the bid do, and what does the bid think that FIFA should do in relation to not just the government of the United States, but let's stick with the government of the United States for now on some of these issues, yeah? So what can a sports organisation or a tournament do in relation to those things like passport checks, like security, where it's the state that's doing this? Because it won't be the organising committee and it won't be FIFA who will be stopping people at borders.
Well, first of all, I don't speak for the bid because it's the bid shut down, and so I formerly worked on the bid. I just want to be clear with that, and I don't currently work for the organizing committee. But that said, the first part of it is identifying it as a risk. So it starts there. And making sure that that's something that is brought to the forefront of these are risks that we need to talk about. Secondly, the bidding requirements talk about internationally recognized human rights, the FIFA bidding requirements. And so when we talk about that, it's not what the U.S. government feels or the Canadian government feels or the Mexican government feels. These are based on international standards. And if there are gaps, then we have to address them. So then we talked, and third is that there were government guarantees that had to be given by each government that cover how they're going to address the gaps and how they are obligated to address those gaps. And I don't know if Federico or anyone has anything else to add to that, but.
Juan Pablo, let's go. We talk quite a lot, as far as actually quite rightly, about risks and negative risks. Can we flip everybody to a bit of positive for a moment here? And I know you and I had a conversation yesterday, and certainly I worked on London 2012, and certainly during the Paralympic Games, the engagement of fans in terms of both numbers and experience, and certainly one of my best ever fan experiences was at London Paralympic Games. I must say that, and been to too many sports games. How can we turn fans and fans' engagement into a positive thing to promote rights?
I think that organizing committees should understand that the legacy is also cultural, meaning they will leave, of course, infrastructure and stadiums, but they will also change people's attitudes towards certain subjects. We saw it very specifically during the London 2012 Paralympic Games, where the organizing committee did a conscious effort on engaging specific stakeholders, meaning the Ministry of Education and the media, specifically the great work of Channel 4. So with the Ministry of Education, what they did was go to all public schools and teach kids the rules of Paralympic sports and engage them and do workshops and get them in chairs and try basketball to blind their eyes and play football and stuff like that. And then Channel 4 did a very smart strategy on seeing how Paralympic sports were a mass media product, something that would sell tickets. They didn't do it out of their generosity of their hearts, but more of as a commercial strategy. And they have fantastic data on it. I don't know it by heart, but I can tell you that they broke records regarding people turning on their TVs, and they did also a lot of surveys, like asking randomly people on the streets if they could name the name of some Paralympian, and many could. Another important piece of data is that all these communications campaigns got people to turn the TV on just out of curiosity, and those people ended up seeing more because they saw that this was something cool. After the games, we've seen that people with disabilities are being more employed. We've seen more accessibility. So I'd say that with all the impacts, sometimes difficult impacts that major events can have in a city and in a community, the cultural impacts specifically regarding the inclusion of people with disabilities can be amazing.
Very good. Ronan, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. That's, we too often look at the legacy or the impact of a competition only through the infrastructure. Now, if we look at on the World Cup in Russia, it's a success in that regard in terms of social impact. Of course, the infrastructure improved, but the way people working in the field of sport, of football, have been trained, the level of security and how it's implemented in the stadium, this leaves a legacy. It's now safer and more enjoyable to go to a stadium in Russia than before the World Cup, and this is hopefully going to last. Now, when the competition is completely disconnected from the country that is hosting it, when it's just a tiny moment in the history of the country, that doesn't work. I'll give you a counter-example. Spain can perfectly host a very welcoming Champions League final, but now this is completely disconnected from the reality of football in the country. Now, you can be a football fan and be treated in a functioning democracy like Spain, like a second-class citizen. Now, there's a lot of second-class citizens, and you might argue that the abuses that we witness towards football fans are not the worst thing you can see in Europe. But you can be severely beaten up just for being an away fan and going to an away game in Spain. You can go to a Champions League final and everything is perfectly fine, and then you're an English fan going to Sevilla or Valencia and being severely beaten up by the police. So this is because those events are disconnected. There's no broader consultation and strategy on how to improve the situation. This is, I just took the example of Spain, but you can go to a game as an away fan in Rome, in Italy, and you're strip search, prison style, in the European Union. You can be barred from traveling to another city in France just because you're an away fan, so because you're a football fan. So very often also football is used as a laboratory for some tests, because as other type of second-class citizen in the society, if they're not able to have a united voice, if they're not able to be heard, then you can do a lot of things to football fans without anyone being concerning about it. In this very country, in France, the away travel ban imposed to fans for the last 7 years was just to football fans for a long time. And now there's a discussion to change the law so that it can be imposed for manifestations as well. And the reason why it's now discussed for manifestation is because it's considered that it worked for football. Well, it didn't work, but it existed for 7 years, so now we can extend it.
I was just going to talk about legacy for a minute, but I don't know if you're going to talk about legacy. I was given advice when we started the work on the bid that said start and end with legacy. And so I think the United bid proposed zero construction of stadiums because there was already existing infrastructure. So we had an opportunity to look at legacy from both a sporting perspective and also from a human rights perspective and a sustainability perspective. And I know sustainability covers human rights, but I'm just going to pull that out given where we are. So one of the things that we did is we said, okay, let's start today and say, what's the legacy we're trying to achieve today? For each one of those areas, be it labor, discrimination, accessibility, all these different areas, what are we trying to achieve based on our risk assessment and where we are today? And then how do we use and embed that into the operations of the event going forward? So I'll give a brief example. One of the things that we did is we went to bid with 32 cities originally. That's huge, right? 3 countries, 32 cities over a continent. And we ended up actually submitting a bid that was 23 cities. So the number of cities for the World Cup is 16. So how do you get from 23 cities to 16 cities? Well, that's a point of leverage. And it also gives you an opportunity to use human rights criteria as part of the selection process. So what we propose to do is to work with human rights stakeholders to design a municipal human rights scorecard for the World Cup. And say, based on a variety of factors, be it LGBT, be it workers' rights, be it a right to work versus a union state, be it disability structure and rights, how do you raise the profile of human rights into the selection process of host cities? And by doing that, 2 things are going to happen that relate to legacy. One, it raises the profile of the discussion around human rights because it's part of the competition process to be a host city. And there's going to be a lot of publicity around that. That's good, right? And the second thing is that in order to come up with answers to human rights risks that have been identified in each one of the candidate host cities, we told them that cities, in order to come up with their plan for addressing those risks as part of their eligibility to be selected, they had to work with stakeholders. And they had to do their own stakeholder engagement reporting on it. So hopefully what that also does is that it creates a construct of having multi-stakeholder engagement in municipalities around human rights, which a lot of times it's a foreign concept. So that's part of the legacy piece that we were trying to create that has nothing to do with infrastructure development.
On that, and Zhan, as far as the issue that we've touched on already as far as leadership is concerned, and we've had some talk already as far as, athletes as leaders and role models. What about putting together athletes with the public as fans to actually have that coalition of leadership? And I think, Juan Pablo, you alluded to that by actually creating interest and creating acceptability. How can we do that better?
Yeah, so I'll go back to actually an Australian example again. But the Australian Human Rights Commission worked with 5 sporting codes, right, to try and identify what the issues were in relation to homophobia and transphobia in sport, use them as leaders, right, but put it within a human rights framework, and then started to roll this out. I think, this is a really smart initiative because it's looking, it's saying, well, we as a statutory body in charge of human rights in this country, identify this as a problem. We also identify that this country, puts a high importance on sport. And that impacts everyone, right? From kids all the way up to adults. And we say that you, as, in these 5 sporting codes, need to step up and join us in saying that these are issues and in working together. I think this, it's a really smart thing. I mean, the thing with sport, though, is that, sport is meant to be about participation and about healthy lifestyle and about camaraderie and about, testing your limits and all those kinds of things. And there's, everyone here knows, there's all these statistics about how kids who participate in sport tend to do better in school because they're more motivated, right? And more focused. But then, I really like what you said earlier, the point about competition. What happens in elite sport when that flips around, when it's no longer about how good you could be or how your enthusiasm or your participation, but it's about how you can kill the other team, right? And for me, this flip, is also about masculinity. Because a lot of sport is a very masculine space, despite the proliferation of women and sporting events for women. But very often I think sport is a masculine space, and this is where I think the schism comes when you start to talk about LGBTI people, because very much of what the LGBTI community represents to, say, a conservative public is the disruption of gender. Right? The disruption of who you want to be with, who you identify yourself as, or what your body looks like. So this, yeah, I mean, it's the line that, I think it's this line, you know, that people tend not to think about, but which then causes LGBTI kids maybe to not participate in sport, because, you know, they may not feel like their coaches or their teachers or their classmates would be supportive, and then it goes all the way down into what we're talking about, which is fans.
Ronan, you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think the world of football, and I include everybody in there, including fans, is a bit too obsessed by waiting for major male players to publicize their homosexuality. So it feels like it's the only issue that can make things go forward. Now, some of the biggest allies to LGBTI fans are actually straight males. A couple of players that have been expressing solidarity. I think it's something. It's deeply wrong in the world of football that we are all waiting for this major football player to publicize his, because we're talking about male players mostly, at least in the interest of, if we're talking about the interest of the general public or the sponsors. Well, there's a lot more we can do, even without the help of such a thing.
Let's throw this out to questions, comments, open to anything really at this point in time. Tim.
Steve, I rise in defence of Australian rules football. The two principal distinguishing characteristics are not the length of the sleeve, but in fact the fact that it's considerably predates association football as a unified code, older and more mature.
I stand corrected.
And it's also the greatest game on earth. But there's a very interesting and powerful history in AFL of Indigenous players standing up, and people like Nicky Winmar, who was one of the first, lifted his shirt and ran around after he'd scored a goal and showing, I am black and I have nothing to fear from you. And there's a statue actually of him now, but they haven't decided yet where they're going to put it. So in fact, the football sector is a bit further ahead than the rest of society in some ways. But the racism persists, it's still there. I just wanted to, I'm an avid fan and I spend a bit of time on the fan boards as well, and I just want to draw attention also to the issue of online abuse and vilification. And the moderators on the space that I visit are good, but there's a continual battle there, and I'm sure that in some of the more closed circles, some of the countries and examples that have been mentioned here in Europe, for example, there are much more serious problems. So it's not just at the stadium and on the way, it's also people's engagement with the game.
That's a good point. And also, we must remember, you know, not just football, but most fans cannot afford to go to stadiums. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Most fans enjoy the game, probably illegally streaming on the internet. Yeah. Yeah. Brent, you should. Over the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Courtney Radge. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists. And as we're speaking about the human rights of fans, I think it's also important to think about, you know, the human rights of those who are covering fans. And so I'd like to know what is being done to address what came out during the FIFA World Cup recently with a lot of female journalists being harassed and assaulted while trying to cover these games, and what is being done both from the organizational but also from the fans' perspective in order to change that.
Hi, Lucy Amos from UNESCO UK. I had a question for the panel, but particularly I think for Ronan, was actually, as civil society organisations, many of you, actually how do you set your own priorities for which campaigns you're going to work on? Do you engage in stakeholder consultation with different affected groups within your own constituency, including women, children, younger people with disabilities, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. And just as another Australian voice in the room, I wanted to raise the issue of gendered violence in fan communities, particularly domestic violence, because this is something that takes place way away from the stadium. Of course, matches are broadcast into every home, or they're on screens everywhere. So in a sense, the transmission of that event into domestic scenarios is a function of the commercialisation of sport. So this is a money-making activity, which leads to increased levels of gender-based violence against women. I mean, it's dangerous to be a woman during the World Cup or at the FA Cup final or during the Super Bowl. It's a dangerous time to be a woman who's in a situation of risk in their own home. I mean, sport acknowledges this, I think. We kind of know it, but what do we do about it? I mean, you know, there's a big iceberg of kind of gender-based violence to melt. There's a whole iceberg to melt. How do we chip away at that? And what's the responsibility of those who are profiting from these events to ameliorate the risk towards those who consequentially suffer from that?
Really great question. Any other points? Yeah.
Hi, Laura Youngson from Equal Playing Field, and I think I just want to say some of the issues you've been raising around more around the men's game, and I think one of the things to be acknowledged is that the women's game has much more of a family atmosphere, and that a lot of women's sport has been able to build a product that's very authentic, accessible and inclusive. So I'd be really interested in what we can learn from the women's game around fan engagement, especially with the Women's World Cup next year, where you can probably take your daughter and have a slightly different chance happening.
Good. I'm going to let the panel and start maybe with Juan Pablo. You choose what you want to respond to from the floor, yeah?
I think maybe I can take on the first one. I'd say that this all comes down to culture sanctions and to social sanctions, and social media helps a lot on that, and what we as a society understand that we can do and that we can't do. And I think that's the way to resolve freedom of expression versus regulation in stadiums and stuff like that. That we all together sanction socially when stuff like being incorrect with female journalists or stuff like that. Well, if we get the Twitter going on how that should not be done, you start educating the societies and cultures start shifting. And I'm happier with that than with regulating what jokes can or can't be said. Just improving spiritually and culturally.
Yeah, real quick, I'll address Courtney's question about journalists. And this is in response to Russia, which you mentioned. But one of the things that was really illuminating for me is understanding the risks that journalists face during the coverage. And I'll give an example of protest. So there's a process called kettling that security, that's a tactic that is employed by police forces that I didn't know about. And basically, for journalists that are embedded into crowds that are covering protest or what have you, they basically round everybody up and arrest them. And that is not just the people who are protesting, but the embedded journalists who are covering it. So, I mean, that's clearly an issue. Once we identified it, we said, okay, so how do we then work with law enforcement to say, you know, these are journalists that need to cover the game later on that day. We need to have an expedited process of making sure that they get released so they can go out and cover the event. So just being aware of, you know, how different things that are happening around stadiums impact journalists, and if not handled correctly, impairs their ability to do their job. So I mentioned this to my son, who's in law enforcement, and of course he's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, this happens. So it was very helpful to simply have the engagement from members of the press to understand what are the risks that they face, which doesn't address the issue of Russia, but certainly having a better understanding of that was really helpful, because then we can take steps to mitigate it through training and awareness.
Yeah, I think I'll just start off by talking about diversity, and I like what you mentioned about women's sports. You know, because I mean, what gets shown at prime time and what is available as the sporting events, right? It's not women's sports, it's men's sports, and it's you know, the mega sports, right? So I mean, before this panel, I was like, no, I'm not a sporting fan, I don't watch anything. But actually, I do watch badminton because I used to play it when I was growing up in Singapore. And it's like so difficult to find badminton anywhere in Australia. It's ridiculous. But, you know, I think that if we promote, if not me, but, you know, if there is a promotion of a diversity of sports, if you get Paralympic Games at prime time, if you get women's sports at prime time, you know, I think this can start to change the perception of who is a sports fan and who sits around drinking beer watching sport. Because if you've got football all the time, you know, it does tend to be, you know, the men who sit around drink beer and then the women are in the kitchen cooking, right?
Thank you. I'll start with the gender-based violence, so then it covers two questions, I think, because the case with the journalist in Russia was that's what it was. At the fan organization, at that very moment, except issuing comments of solidarity, there is nothing much we could do. Now, it was appalling scenes in Russia, but I think the employers there have a responsibility as well, and a lot has to do with the absence of proper risk assessment. Now, when you have a crowd already hostile, like in the street of Moscow or in the stadium, and you send a young woman to interview them, to serve them beer, or even worse, with a hug me sign, then you're taking risks. You put them at risks. I'm not excusing the behavior from the fans, but if there is a proper risk assessment, there is a proper analysis of how the crowd is working, that might not be a good idea to send a woman in the middle of the crowd. About the engagement in our priorities, we're a democratic organization, so we have every second year we have a general meeting. Now we have General Assembly where we decide on our priorities. Now we have groups of fans that work on specific issues. You mentioned disabled fans. There is a specific organization called CAFE that works with disabled fans, so that's not a topic. But one of our big priorities at the moment is LGBTI fan groups. This is a form of discrimination that's been widely forgotten by the world of football, and I'm including all stakeholders there. Everybody understands what racism is, and the fight of racism in football, I think it's something that's been acknowledged by most stakeholders. But homophobia is something else. It's been forgotten. In most of the regulations from the European FA, discrimination based on sexual orientation is not even mentioned, so it's not a thing. So there's a lot of work to do there, and we're trying to do that by building alliances between progressive parties in every stakeholder. So we're currently launching a project, Erasmus Plus project, with the help of UEFA in partnership with FIFPro to build those bridges between various stakeholders that want to do something to fight homophobia in football. That's really a priority topic. And when it comes to women's football, we're representing active fans, and unfortunately, there are not so many active fans yet in women's football. It's growing. There are more and more groups that are going both to men's football and women's football, but it's just the beginning. So we'll try to accompany this.
Sorry, can you talk though to women fans that go to men's football matches?
That's another thing. There are a lot. I mean, depending on countries, there are countries where the percentage of women in the stadium is much higher than others, and it doesn't necessarily depend on the status of women's rights in the country. That there's no correlation. We have tried to highlight the role of women's fans in men's football. We have an exhibition that is currently touring in Europe on this. It's a big question for us. It's difficult as a fan organization to have a proper gender balance because there are more men supporting football than women. It's always been a big question for us. I'm a man. Some of my colleagues are men. We have a gender balance in the office, but not in the board. That's something we're trying to address by identifying potential representative for our organization that can join our board, trying to help them, push them to that direction. But it's obviously a challenge, and I think there are 14 national fans organizations in Europe, proper structured organization. I think only in Sweden they would have a proper gender balance. Elsewhere it doesn't exist yet.
Okay, just to round up, we've been given a few more minutes to round up, and I just want to throw one question back along the panel, because we deliberately and understandably, we've had challenging issues here, and they're lying on the table. And I think they should be lying on the table because we're starting to understand some of the issues around fans rather than coming with solutions necessarily. But if, let's say, on the fifth anniversary of your appointment, Mary, if we're all back wherever we're back on there. By the way, I'll tell you, this was an extended job interview, and I can confirm you've got the job now, yeah? So the issue is, if in 5 years' time we're saying, what's changed for fans from this discussion, what would you say? And I'm going to give mine first. I'm going to say we will not be talking about only football fans and only about men's football. We'll be talking about tennis. We'll be talking, if we want, monster truck racing. You know, hundreds of thousands of people go and look at that. What would you want, and I'm going to start with Mary, in 5 years' time, that we were talking about in relation to fans?
So many things. First of all, that we're not talking about fans in terms of segments that are affected. That we're talking about fans as a group of people that aren't separated by gender identity or sexual orientation or disability, be it visible or not. Disability, sensory disabilities are often not visible. And that we're not having discussions around what bathrooms people use and things like this. That we're having a discussion around fan experience that is beyond those segments and those divisions and those issues that we talk about today.
Yeah, I think I would like to see a sporting fan be also a fan of art and culture. You know, for me, sport should be part of a bigger picture of a human experience, and art and culture should be part of a bigger experience of bigger part of human experience. And I think there tends to be a separation. You know, if you're into sport, then you're this kind of person, and if you're into art and culture, you're another kind of person. But really, it would be really great to think about sporting events as art and cultural events as well, because it doesn't make sense. It's a holistic experience. So yeah, I'd love to see that.
Great answer, and also not sponsored by UNESCO as well, which is very good, yeah?
Yeah, I'll go back to my first impression of who were the fans that I was thinking about when we started. It's again the away fans. So in 5 years' time, I would like for fans to be able to travel freely in Europe, not to face police violence, not to face unlawful body searches for women traveling to away games, not to have to remove their bra at the body searches, and enjoy football for a fair price. And you mentioned it earlier. It's a real challenge. And now that the TV rights are skyrocketing, what's the point of asking someone to pay €100 to attend a football match when it's representing a very tiny percentage of the incomes of a club? So that's also part of making football more inclusive.
Juan Pablo.
I'd say that there's an important difference between the civil rights of people with disabilities and other social collectives, mainly on the motivation of the discrimination. Because the motivation to discriminate people with disabilities is more ignorance than hate. We could argue if hate is a type of ignorance, but the point I want to make is there are no groups, organized groups, discriminating us. There's not a clan against blind people. No one feels that their religious or moral principles are questioned if someone deaf wants to get married or adopt. And of course that's fantastic because we don't have any associated violence towards our community in that regard. But it's also at the same time a big problem because it's easier to ignore, and it's easier to, not do anything about it. So in 5 years' time, I would love to see the issue of rights of people with disabilities more mainstreamed, people more educated and understanding this community as a civil rights collective in full capacity to claim those rights.
Great, thank you very much. I will say no more words apart from to say, will you join with me in thanking a really excellent panel?